What qualifies as art? Is art purely subjective, or is there a limit to what we can safely call art? That is what Noah and I wanted to find out. Using the ladder of abstraction, we came up with the knowledge question. To what extent can a form of media be considered art? To figure out the answer to this, we chose a form of media that people don't naturally associate with art: video games. We then created a carefully written survey for people to complete in order to find out what people think of art, what they think qualifies as art, and whether or not they consider video games to be art. The answers we got were actually quite surprising. Before we created the survey, Noah and I hypothesized that if we were to survey 100 people, a majority would say that video games are considered art. We also predicted that younger people would be more likely to consider video games art than older people, and we figured men would be more likely than women to consider them art. To see if there was any correlation between gender, age, or even race and what they considered art, we asked people how old they were, what gender they were, and what race they were in the survey. We were also very particular about the order we put the questions in. We first asked if they played video games, and if so, how often. Obviously, someone who doesn't play video games would likely view them differently than someone who does. We then asked whether or not they considered movies and books to be art. Next, we asked them to describe in their own words what they considered art and what they felt qualified to be art. Many people said what we discussed in class. They considered art to be subjective, something that portrays emotion, and something that expresses creativity. After we allowed them to think about what they considered art, we then asked them whether or not they considered video games to be art. The interesting thing is that, while many people considered movies and books to be art, they did not consider video games art. Moreover, many people contradicted themselves with their own definition of art and their decision of not considering games art. Oddly enough, you could say that none of this actually matters. Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association was a Supreme Court case that ended in 2011 when the Supreme Court officially recognized video games as art, giving them the same First Amendment protection as other forms of media such as books and plays and comics. Of course, even though politically video games are seen as art, there is still a large controversy about whether or not video games can be held to the same accountability as movies and books and plays. If the sole purpose of art is to portray emotion to the viewer, then video games most certainly meet that qualification. There are many games out there with the intent just to get the player emotionally invested, and do so wonderfully with the added bonus of being interactive, something that books, music, and movies are not. In 2012, the Smithsonian even opened an exhibit called The Art of Video Games. Our final thoughts from this project were that of surprise. Even though our hypothesis was correct, there were certainly more people who said that video games were not art than either of us expected. Out of the 140 people who took the survey, 94% said movies were art, 91% said books were art, but only 71% said video games were considered art. We are glad, however, that a majority of people are able to realize that art comes in any form, whether it be traditional or modern.